Hello students, Mr. Yun here with Chapter 26, Lesson 1, Part 1. This lesson is called Challenges in Latin America. We're breaking it down into two. A big part of tomorrow's lesson will be Mexico, so we're not going to really talk about Mexico much today. We'll hit that tomorrow. Today we're going to talk a lot about places like Cuba and Haiti and sort of Central America in general. So when someone says they're American, that's actually a very vague statement. Because there's, North America, alright, that's where people assume you're from when you're American, but there's also Central America and South America. I've always thought it was funny that when you say you're an American, people automatically assume you're from the United States. Another funny thing about all of us being Americans, technically, is that North America, Central America, and South America are very, very different. Really, once you get, south of Texas, you get into Latin America, if you will. Things are very different and kind of troublesome. Turbulent past is how I would describe Latin America, and today we're going to start learning all about it. So, gonna move my box here. Whoa! All right, most of Latin America, think Mexico and everything south of it, including the islands, won their freedom in the 1800s, and that's good for them, but the problem is that you ended up having a wealthy few, an elite if you will, controlling most of the government and wealth in many of these countries. A great deal of the population was poor farmers who didn't really get to partake in any freedom. In the late 1800s, farmers and mining were key in Latin America. Foreign interests bought up raw materials such as sugar, coffee, copper, oil, and then exported them back to their home countries, kind of almost like a business imperialism. Many countries in Latin America only had one or two exports that they basically relied on. So as long as those exports were doing well, the country would prosper. But if there was, say, a bad harvest of coffee that year and that was their only export, the whole economy would be wrecked because it depended on that sole export. It pretty much wrecked the economy. So versatile economies, very turbulent, if you will. Exporting goods was not all bad for Latin America, nor was the foreign investors. It behooved those foreign companies to improve the infrastructure in these countries to help them with their business, and these improvements helped the people as well. Think things like dams, bridges, factories that provided jobs. Sometimes you had hospitals being built and things like that. Infrastructure. These are things that are good for the population. A middle class did in fact develop. However, this middle class remains very small to this day. Mostly you just have very rich people and very poor people. Alright, the U.S. became heavily involved in Latin America, particularly after the Spanish-American War, which ended in 1898. Part of this war ending was that the U.S. picked up Puerto Rico, which remains a U.S. territory to this day. The U.S. also helped Panama break free from the country of Colombia, and in exchange, Panama allowed us to build the Panama Canal there. And then so between the Panama Canal and all these American companies and businesses and railroads and factories like the United Fruit Factory, we had a lot of money down there, and so U.S. troops were in places like Puerto Rico and in Latin America to protect these interests. Now, this actually began to worry the folks in Latin America because they thought that American influence was becoming too powerful. In 1933, you had Franklin Delano Roosevelt announce the Good Neighbor policy, where he basically tried to assuage these fears by saying, if there's any kind of problem between us and Latin America, we promise not to use our military or force to deal with it, and we're going to help you build your economies. That was the Good Neighbor policy. Now, after World War II, multinational corporations provided funding for the continued growth of manufacturing in Latin America. However, a lot of Latin American leaders wanted more growth and faster growth, so they borrowed money from foreign banks. But they borrowed too much, their economies didn't grow enough, and they ended up having a big debt crisis in the 80s. The silver lining to this debt crisis is then you end up having people overthrowing their dictators. In some cases, they had democratically elected governments out of that, but in a lot of cases, they overthrew one dictator and traded it for another. They still have a lot of problems in Latin America. For example, population growth can't really be sustained by their limited resources. You have a massive poor-rich divide, and the drug trade, leads to a lot of crime and corruption. Alright, moving specifically to the Caribbean and Central America. A common theme in these places is that you have a wealthy elite, sort of a centrist government, an elite government, based in the cities, and then when you get out of the country, that's where rebels are. That basically run an insurgency against the government. It's a pretty common theme in these places. When you shoot over to Cuba, the history of Cuba, you had a nation that had been free since the 1800s, however, had been ruled by a number of dictators that weren't that great. It was heavily tied to the United States in industry. There were a lot of American industries in Cuba, and a lot of Cuba didn't like that. In the year 1959, a lawyer, Fidel Castro, led a revolution that overthrew the Cuban government, and Fidel Castro basically installed himself as dictator of a communist government there. He nationalized the American industry there. Basically, he took all the American companies that were there and said, okay, you're mine now. Going to work for me. And the Americans weren't very happy about that. They tried to, well, as a result, in 1960, they imposed a partial trade embargo, or a ban with Cuba. In 61, the U.S. tried to overthrow Fidel Castro by using what's called the Bay of Pigs invasion. It was a failed disaster. We had taken Cubans that had run away from Cuba to escape, the Castro regime. The CIA trained them as soldiers and then sent them back to take the country back over, but it failed. Cuba's forces, the Castro's forces, under the direct command of Fidel Castro, basically fought off these rebels, and it didn't work. The CIA tried to assassinate Castro multiple times, and it always failed. And these things are pretty much why we haven't been good friends with Cuba for a long time. Alright, now Castro, it sounds like okay, like American industry is abusing Cuban people, we're going to take them over. But Fidel Castro was a terrible communist dictator. That's why Cubans fled. Before you had this immigration debacle that you're more familiar with, in the 90s we were always talking about Cubans hopping on rafts and going to Florida because it stunk to live in Cuba. Fidel Castro, it's said that not a family in Cuba has gone without being touched by Castro. He murdered a lot of people that he saw as political dissidents and put them in labor camps and things like that. We're talking like 100,000 people killed in a country with a population at the time was 6.2 million. It wasn't good. They had a lot of support from their communist brothers over in the Soviet Union, but when the Soviet Union fell in 1991, that kind of left Cuba on its own. Fidel Castro actually managed to rule until 2000, what year was it? 8, when he just became too old and sick to rule the country, so the rule of Cuba went to his slightly more moderate brother, Raul Castro. Okay, bumping over to Haiti. Haiti had a problem with dictators as well. In 1957, Francois Duvalier was elected to rule Haiti, but he soon became a terrorizing dictator. He died in 1971, and his son became the ruler, who was also a terrible dictator. The military overthrew him in 1986. Haiti elected a reformer in Jean-Bertrand Aristide in 1990. However, the military overthrew him as well. A year later, at this point, the USA became involved, and they liked Aristide, so they got him back in power in 1994. But 10 years later, he was once again overthrown, and Haiti is basically still a mess, especially after that 2010 earthquake that destroyed their capital, Port-au-Prince. I remember all those people were sending money to Haiti, and it's still kind of a mess. Okay, throughout the 70s, 80s, Central America was basically a mess of civil wars because you had Fidel Castro pushing communism and the USA pushing democracy. It was kind of like a mini Cold War right there in Central America. In Nicaragua, for example, there was this basically a communist group called the Sandinistas, and they overthrew the dictator, Anastasio Somoza. So, alright, overthrowing dictators good, and the Sandinistas were in control until 1990. Starting in 1981, there was a USA-backed group of rebels called the Contras who fought the Sandinistas, sort of your typical, country militia. The Contras actually disbanded in 1990 when the Sandinistas lost power legitimately through election. They lost power in the government through the elections, so the Contras disbanded. They actually elected the first woman president. Crazy thing, though, back in 2006, the Sandinistas regained power through election, through democracy, so the Sandinistas are in control again, but no Contras. Guatemala was torn apart by civil war for decades, the 60s through 96. It's still a mess. Panama is doing all right because in 1999 we gave them control of the Panama Canal, so a lot of shipping goes through the Panama Canal. There it is. I mean, now you don't have to sail around South Africa or South America to get from the Atlantic to the Pacific. You go through the Panama Canal, so a ton of shipping goes through there, and so they make a lot of money off that, and so their shipping and banking industry is doing very well. That's our lesson for the day. That's a lot for half a lesson. You have a 6-point quiz on the next page. It's only 3 questions. Tomorrow's lesson, part 2, will have 3 questions as well. So it'll be a 12-point lesson essentially. That's it for today. I know we went over a lot. Welcome to look at the book. I think I nailed it all here in the lesson. If you have any questions, please let me know. Otherwise, have a great day.